afternoon, everybody, and welcome along to Data Platform Downunder. My name's Warwick Rudd, and in conjunction with Martin Catherall, your co-hosts for Data Platform Downunder Virtual. In this session today, our second session for February 2021, we've got Anupama Natarajan talking to us about tips to monitor your Azure SQL database. This session is being recorded and will be made available on our YouTube channel probably later this afternoon or tomorrow for you to be able to come back and rewatch this session at any point in time. Anu has also agreed to supply us with her slide deck, and if there are any demos, we'll add those to the materials that you're able to come back and look at a later time. That's about it from us. If you can hold your questions more towards the end of the session, we'll look at asking Anu those questions more towards the end. So therefore, hopefully she covers all of your questions prior to you answering them. So with that, I'll hand over to Anu for today's session.
Great, thanks, Warwick. Let me quickly share my screen. Cool. So welcome everyone to the Data Platform Downunder session. So today we are going to look at the topic around tips to monitor your Azure SQL database. So before we get into this session, just a little bit about myself. I just want to introduce. So I'm Anupama Natarajan, and I'm a data and AI consultant, and I live in Wellington, New Zealand. I have got 20 plus years of experience working in the IT industry. So started my career as a developer, then moved on to designing databases and data warehouses, and also now working on more like how do I do AI enabled applications. So I'm a Microsoft MVP for AI and a Microsoft certified trainer and a speaker. And I do organize the local user group events as well as the SQL Saturday event in Wellington. And if you have any questions regarding this session or any other general questions related to monitoring your Azure SQL databases, feel free to reach out to me through any of my social channels as listed here. And I'm happy to just answer your questions today, or I can get back to you based on if you're reaching out to me at a later point. So with that note, let us quickly look at the agenda for today's session. So what I'm going to start with is introducing you around why monitoring is really important for databases. We will look at some of the monitoring options that you have got for Azure SQL database just right in the Azure portal. So we are not going to install any third-party products or anything. Yes, of course, there are a lot of third-party products which can provide you the monitoring capabilities. But what we are going to look in this session is what are we getting out of the box through the Azure portal, and how can we start utilizing them. I will also quote some references that you can take back and refer to at a later point post this session. And finally, towards the end of the session, I will take up questions that comes out of these topics I'm covering today. So why does monitoring is really important for databases? If you think about whether you are a developer or a database administrator or a site reliability engineer or even a DevOps professional, I think your day-to-day job will involve some sort of interacting with databases. And you need to make sure the databases are working fine so that your applications doesn't have any issues. And so to keep your databases working fine, you need to just make sure you have to have proactive monitoring. So I work for a lot of consulting organizations, and even till date, I find a lot of organizations not even having a basic level of monitoring of their critical databases. And that is really hard and frustrating too as a consultant. And go in there and you expect certain basic fundamental things should be there. And if that doesn't exist, that is way fundamentally you need to start with the organization saying what you can get out of the box. Because a lot of people think okay, if you need monitoring, we need to go for third-party tools. But you can start something simple, look at what's available out of the box. And especially in this scenario, we'll be looking at what's available right through the Azure portal itself. And of course, if you want some sort of sophisticated functionalities, then you can start looking at evaluating third-party tools and stuff. And why do we need monitoring? So if you think about modern applications that people are developing these days, like where the databases, especially they span across like whether on premises or even as or even on the cloud. So which means like you have to make sure like in order to serve your applications, you need to make sure these databases are available and also they are performing really well, because monitoring is not about just looking at okay, is my database available and can I pull the data out of it. It also looks at like am I able to pull the data at the in the right timings I need it, and also am I getting the performance that I really require. So that is also is really important when it comes to monitoring. So identifying poorly performing databases and optimizing them in order to get better outcomes for your organization. So that leads to in terms of what are the things I really need to monitor, especially when we talk about cloud databases. What are the things that can hit me? You can monitor a wide variety of things like your CPU, your memory, your IO. Even though we are talking about cloud databases here, you may think about I don't have servers. So I'm talking about Azure SQL database. It's going to be a PaaS service. Why do I need to worry about CPU? Why do I need to worry about memory and IO? But if you think about your organization, they will be worrying about the cost, right? So that is an easy way to explain to anyone in your organization. So when you are like provisioning like your Azure SQL databases, you will be thinking about in terms of number of DTUs to allocate or the vCos to allocate. And that comes up with a cost behind the scenes. And your DTUs and vCos are nothing but it's a combination of the resources where the different versions will have different levels of CPU, memory, and IO allocated to that. So what you have to monitor is like are we hitting the maximum in terms of our DTUs, and what is causing it? Is it our queries are running really slow and that is creating the bottleneck? Are we having far too much of data than what we thought originally? So all these factors that you have to monitor, so you can decide on okay, do I need to scale up the amount of DTUs here or not? And that's the thing when it comes to monitoring, you need to be looking for your Azure SQL databases. So some real world examples around what we used to do is we always start with a lower DTUs, because we know like okay, this is what the data consumption currently we are looking at, but we periodically monitor it. And what we noticed was as soon as the data is starting to increase and our queries are starting to take more time to execute, then we know like okay, this is the next level that we need to move on to in terms of our DTUs. And we proactively monitor the performance of our queries and the consumption of our DTUs. And of course, we also monitor like okay, how our databases are performing. Like, are we having high availability here? And if things are getting going down for maintenance purposes, are we getting notified and so on? So all these factors you have to monitor, starting from CPU, memory, IO, and also like the availability of your databases. So we know why monitoring is important. We also understood what are the things that we have to monitor. But then the question is all around what do we have got on the Azure portal, like out of the box, without looking into third party tools for monitoring. Can I monitor with what I have got, or can I start with monitoring what I have got on the Azure portal? Yes, of course. So what we are going to look at in the next few minutes is around what are the different options that you have got in terms of monitoring. And also we will look at the demos of that around how do we go and figure that out in the Azure portal. So we'll start with Azure Monitor. So the main thing with Azure Monitor is in a quicker view, once you provision your Azure SQL database, you can just jump onto the Azure portal, and under the monitoring section as listed here, you can click on metrics, and quite quickly you can start looking at some of the key metrics that are available out of the box, like what is the CPU percentage consumption, what is the DTU consumption, how is your data IO as well as log IO is performing. All these things is going to provide you right in front of you through the Azure portal itself. So here we are using the capabilities and the metrics that are available as part of the Azure Monitor. So instead of me just talking about that, let me quickly show you where you can find them. Just give me a sec. I'll just drag the. So here I have got a resource group for data platform Downunder, which I have created, and I have also provisioned a Azure SQL database. So this is again a PaaS database that is provisioned, and I have got some sort of activity going on. So what I have done is I have got a simple Azure function that is running, and this is running every minute, like as a timer based Azure function. So what it does is like it goes and queries my Azure SQL database every minute and just does some select queries periodically. So just to show some activity that is happening in my Azure SQL database here. So cool. So that I have got provisioned here. So as I mentioned before, the out of the box first thing in terms of monitoring is my metrics. So here I have got my metrics dashboard, got my database listed here. Now I can start looking at what is the CPU percentage that is being consumed by my application here. So this is when I started running my Azure functions. And as you can see here, that there is a bit of activity happening in my SQL database. And what I can do here is like there is a granularity that you can go and look at. So most probably people will be looking at what's happening in real time, like what's happening in the last 30 minutes on my database. You can go ahead and find that out and how much CPU consumption is happening here. And you can keep adding additional metrics right away here. So here I have got my CPU percentage. I can go ahead and add a metric, and I can choose a metric saying, okay, show me my DTU percentage here. And there you go. So I can start overlying things that I want to monitor here. And the other point is I can keep adding, okay, show me my log IO percentage. Cool. So you can start looking at like, okay, if there is some activity going on, then you can start looking at what is your CPU percentage, DTU percentage, as well as log IO percentage. And all these metrics which I'm talking here about, you can keep on adding them as much as you want. So these are the different metrics that you can have, and you can build your own dashboards using the Azure Monitor here. So this is, you can pin it to your own dashboards. You can change the line chart to an area chart or a bar chart if you need to, so that you can start looking at things that you want to do. And another key thing I really like is around, as I said, this is the last 30 minutes, right? So you can go and look at for the activity for your last 30 days, what's going on here, or you can even go for a custom start time and end time. So I can just go and see like how far back I need to go, and I can go here. One thing to note here is when I say how far back you can go, you need to pay for the storage for that. So if you want Azure to maintain your metrics for the last year or something, then probably like there will be some additional cost that you need to pay. But if it is like a last 90 days or something, then it is already available out of the box. So you can keep it like, okay, last 90 days worth of log analytics, you can provision and hold the metrics in there. But anything beyond that comes up with a cost because all this data needs to be stored on Azure. So something to keep in mind, just to hold on to the data that you really require, and that will help you in terms of your monitoring purposes. So the idea behind here is you can break down the granularity to, so okay, per minute, what's going on in my Azure SQL database. Let me apply for the last 30 minutes so that you will have a better view here. So as you can see here, like this gives me a better view of what's going on in terms of like the granularity here I have got is in the last 30 minutes on a every minute activity, what's happening here. So this is the first thing that you can get out of the box using the metrics within the Azure portal itself. Few other things that will be really handy is you can add a new alert. So for instance, if you want to alert on whether my CPU percentage is greater than a certain amount or my DTU percentage goes greater than certain percentage, then you can automatically set an alert to say whether someone needs to be notified by email or text, or even you can integrate that with your third-party applications in your organization, like your ticketing system or even Microsoft Teams or Slack channels or something. So if you want to go ahead and alert in that mechanism, you can go ahead and set up your alert rules through here. So this is all out of the box. And as you can see here, for an estimated cost of 10 cents USD, you'll be able to just set up the alert, as many as alerts that you need to. So this is a quicker way how you can start setting up monitoring for your Azure SQL database in here. Cool. So let me get back to my slides here. So we looked at the first way, how do we do monitoring using Azure Monitor. But being a DBA or who likes to always work on tools like a SQL Management Studio or Azure Data Studio and things that you would like to run your own queries. So you don't want to have this graphical user interface or the portal interface in order to identify what's going on with your Azure SQL database. So you may be thinking about, is there an ability where I can go ahead and run my own queries to identify the same things which you saw on the portal, like what is my CPU consumption, DTU consumption, which queries are running and how long it is taking for the queries in terms of execution. And can I just to understand a few things about my Azure SQL database itself? What is the size of my current database and what is the growth that is really, because as a DBA you need to understand the growth of your databases also, not just looking at performance and things, because sometimes like you may be allocating a certain amount of size for your Azure SQL database and you need to periodically monitor the growth, and also you need to plan ahead in terms of, okay, this is my growth rate of my database, do I need to move on or thinking about like moving on to the next layer or something, or a pricing model for my databases. So how Azure SQL helps you in terms of running your own scripts to monitor these things is with the use of dynamic management views, or also called as DMVs. So you can use the DMVs on Azure SQL database in order to diagnose any performance problems or things like long running queries, your resource bottlenecks that you have got in terms of IO, CPU, or DTUs. If you have any poor query plans and you want to optimize your queries, you can run your DMVs to identify them and also like find ways to fix them. So this is typically available for your on-premises SQL Server. So if you want to monitor and performance manage them, similarly, you have the same capability available on the Azure SQL also. So what are the things that you can do with your DMVs? You can identify your, sorry, it's a CPU performance issues. You identify your IO issues, your TempDB performance issues. You can find out even any long running transactions as well as high memory consumption statements, monitoring connections. And this is an important thing too, because we have a situation with one of our client where people connect to the Azure database and they don't have any visibility on which application is connecting or who is connecting it. So when we looked at this particular DMV, which allows us to monitor what are the different connections that are established to the Azure SQL, we were able to pin down to figure out, okay, someone else from this particular server is trying to connect to the Azure SQL database, and we were able to figure out who that person is and what is the purpose of that. Sometimes you don't know, like these type of things can also create bottlenecks on your Azure SQL database, because what we figured out was someone was running a query and that query was not well optimized, and the query was running like every 5 minutes hitting the Azure SQL database, and we were, without the ability to monitor the connections, we weren't able to figure out who was running it and from where they were running the query and what is the query that they were running. So all this information was easily we were able to trace it with the help of the monitor connections DMV. So few other things that you can monitor, not only like where, as I said, like the queries, the connections that are happening, but also like resource usage. So there are a lot of out of the box DMVs that are available. So where you can figure out like what is the resources that are being consumed in terms of CPUs, IOs, and how many concurrent requests and concurrent logins are happening to your on your Azure SQL database, as well as you can monitor the query performance. Like you can find out like the top 10 queries that are really consuming resources on your Azure SQL. You can monitor the query plans of your highly resource consuming queries, and also you can monitor for any blocked queries. So DMVs, there is a wealth of DMVs that are available on the Azure SQL database, which you can run as a DBA, and you can find out all bottlenecks that are happening on your Azure SQL database. We will quickly look at a couple of DMVs, and what I will also do is like in the references section on this slide, I have linked to some URLs, and these URLs provide you some additional DMVs that you can go and execute it by yourself. Cool. So let me drag and drop this. So what I have got here is my Azure SQL database. So this is the exact database I have provisioned. So my Azure SQL demo 13. So this is the server and this is the database. So as you can see here, the database that I showed you on the Azure portal, now I was able to connect it through my SQL Server Management Studio here. And as part of provisioning the database, I made sure like it gets the default database that is available. So which means the default database tables are already created here for me. So the adventure works basically database that is available that you can create in here and you can start using it for your demos. So one thing to keep in mind is if you are provisioning an Azure SQL as a playpen that you want to try and do some sort of queries or practice some of the monitoring capabilities, when you are provisioning the Azure SQL, make sure like you want a sample database to be also provisioned. Let me quickly show you how do you go about doing that. So this is on my Azure portal. I'm going to search on the marketplace for Azure SQL. So as part of searching for Azure SQL, I can just go ahead and provision that also. So the main idea is like you don't need to worry about I have to have a sample database. I need to create tables and things. So Microsoft have made our life really easy. So when you create the database here, you can choose a single database. And so cool things here, this is what I was talking about. As part of provisioning, jump onto additional settings and say like I need some sample database to be created. So in this case, that's what I have enabled as part of provisioning my Azure SQL, which helped me to get these tables already available. So which means now I can write a simple application that periodically queries these tables and start looking at like how can I do some sort of monitoring activities on this particular database. So here are some of the DMVs that are available. So where you can look for the top 10 CPU consuming queries if you need to, and how many active CPU consuming queries I have got by sessions. So this is another one which I said like, is there any who are the people who are connecting or what are the different connections that are happening onto my Azure SQL database. So as you can see here, the current connection is only my desktop here. And also I have got an Azure function that is running, but because it is running on a schedule, like only when it is running, you can see that connection being established to the Azure SQL database. So these are some of the DMVs, but you have wealth of other DMVs, as I mentioned, available in the references section, which you can utilize in order to monitor the performance of your Azure SQL database. Jumping on to my slides back again. So we saw how can you use Azure Monitor, look at the metrics via the Azure portal. I also like showed you like there are some DMVs which you can use, which are available out of the box. Just what you need to do is just connect to your Azure SQL database either via your management studio or even with the Azure Data Studio. And then you can execute the DMVs and you can get better performance insights as well as the monitoring activities of your Azure SQL database. And first one, you can set alert rules and things straight via the Azure portal. And dynamic management views, I would say more for if I get an alert, if I want to do in-depth analysis about what's going on, that's when I will start jumping on using my dynamic management views. But if you don't want to get down to this level, you can still stick on to the Azure monitor itself and monitor the metrics. There are other ways where you can get in-depth information, which I'll be showcasing you shortly. The third way how you can do monitoring out of the box with Azure SQL is using the query performance insight. So this is mainly to understand like how can you get deeper insights on your CPU consumption, especially from a query perspective, which queries are actually taking up more of the CPU or the IO, and you can drill down to the level of like to the query level to find out which query is actually causing the bottleneck. And out of the box, again, you get this on Azure SQL database. So here you can go to your Azure SQL database and under the intelligent performance section, you can see the query performance insight. To give you a nutshell in a real world scenario, we use this particular functionality a lot with our clients. So whenever there is an issue in terms of performance issues that we found out, and if they are not sure about which queries are hitting their Azure SQL database and how often they are hitting, we straight away jump onto the query performance insight, and we will be able to track out and say like, okay, which query is actually causing the bottleneck here. So here I can get the top 5 queries by CPU, the data IO or the log IO, and this is going to give me the query ID. And when I click on the query ID, I will actually get to see the query itself, the actual query itself that is causing, and number of executions of that. So one of my client has got the same query executing every 5 minutes, or the Azure function which I was talking to you, like the sample one which I have got, I'm hitting the database with the same for the same queries like periodically on every minute. So if that query is not performing really well, then probably I will know like that query, given it is running every minute, I will get the total execution count of that and how much of CPU percentage consumption it is actually taking up through just looking at the query performance insight. In order to get the query performance insight working, you need to enable the query store. So query store has to be enabled in order to get the query performance insight. So let us quickly look at how does query performance insight works out from an Azure portal perspective. So just jumping again onto my Azure portal here. So I'll get back to my Azure SQL database. Cool. So here I mentioned like the under the intelligent performance, you can see the query performance insight. Cool. So this is where I can see the activities happening about my queries. And as I can see here, there is quite a few queries that are running in this space. And I can see like, okay, how much of executions that are happening, and is there any CPU? So you can't see much of CPU percentage because I'm doing just a select statement query across the things. But if I click on this, you can see the query that is getting executed. So in this case, it's not creating a huge performance bottleneck or anything for me, but the idea is pretty clear. So this query is getting executed, and I have got n number of executions happening in here. And what you can see is how long it takes to execute this query, as well as like from the previous I can see the number of executions that has happened. And I'm running this query every minute through my Azure function, which I'll showcase to you shortly. And there is another, so there is a set of 5 different queries I'm actually executing through my Azure function on every minute basis. But I can get down to this level of saying what those queries are. So that is the idea behind here. So if you know, like if you have any performance bottleneck, or if someone comes and tells you like there is a performance bottleneck that they are seeing in the Azure SQL, or there is a huge amount of DTU consumption, you can drill down here and figure out like, okay, which particular query is causing the bottleneck. Look at the query text, and you can start looking at optimizing your queries. So that's again an out of the box capability that you have got on Azure SQL. So Azure SQL is also clever enough because they use a lot of AI capabilities within the monitoring in Azure SQL, which means if a particular query takes a long time to execute, and if it is getting frequently executed on your Azure SQL database, you will start getting some sort of performance recommendations here saying like, okay, you may need to add a particular index in order to make this particular query more performant. So those recommendations that you can see here, currently I'm not seeing here because my queries are not performing bad. But if you start seeing the queries are performing bad, you can start seeing some recommendations appearing here. So you can decide on discarding the recommendation, or you can manually apply them, or also Azure SQL gives you the capability to automate. So if it finds any recommendations that is going to improve the performance of your queries, you can automate it to say like, okay, apply those recommendations as and when Azure finds it out. It may be easy for a normal person to just go and automate it, but if you are a DBA, you will always be careful, right? You'll be always thinking about, I want to look at what is the index Azure is trying to add to my database, and I need to have a better visibility on that. So here, in that case, you don't need to automate it. You can manually look at the recommendations and you can decide on whether you want to apply it or not. For people like who wants to automate it, you may think about, because not always indexes are going to improve the performance, and sometimes like it can go the negative way also. So Azure is clever enough because, as I said, like it has got the AI capabilities. It's not only discover, it doesn't discover just you need indexes. It can also discover saying, okay, I applied this indexes, and it will still keep monitoring the queries. But if the performance of the queries have been degraded since then, since applying the index, then it will automatically roll back also. So that automatic rollback capability is also available if you're automating the applying the recommendations via the Azure portal here. So keep that in mind. If you're automating it, like both positive and negative things will be happening. Like if your index is performing, it will keep the index. But if the index that is applied is not performing well based on what it is seeing from the history, it will roll back the changes also automatically. But as a typical DBA, if you want to view and manually apply the indexes, you can go ahead and do that. So the main reason I'm highlighting this is like you have this capability where the performance recommendations will be provided to you based on how your query is performing. And you can either go and manually check the queries and tweak your queries, or you can go and look at the performance recommendations from Azure and apply based on that appropriately. So the next option is your Azure Intelligent Insights. So this is really important because the Azure Intelligent Insights, what it gives is a wealth of information. So that will help you to do proactive monitoring of your Azure SQL database. You can do a lot of like a root cause analysis, like what could have gone out. And also you can decide on like, okay, have we reached a bottleneck here? And we have to think about scaling out our Azure SQL database. Or is there any performance issue that we are noticing? And what is the recommendations that we are getting from Azure? And also like a positive impact to your DevOps resources or your total cost of ownership. So all these things you can pretty much get as part of your Azure Intelligent Insights. So what it allows you to do is, as I mentioned, this is that AI capability I was talking here. So it has got built-in intelligence to continuously monitor your Azure SQL database usage. So what it is going to do is like monitor your queries, monitor like what are the things that can cause poor performance on your Azure SQL database. And once it looks into it and it detects it, then probably it is going to do a root cause analysis saying, okay, if this query is executing and which is causing a performance bottleneck, what could be the problem here? Is it a missing index, or there is an unnecessary index that has been added which needs to be dropped? So Azure will do that behind the scenes with the help of artificial intelligence capabilities, and it is going to just highlight to you saying, okay, this is what the recommendation that you have to apply in order to get things going on the Azure SQL database. So where do we go and find that out? So we can quite easily do that again on the Azure portal. Let me get this back. So here you will be seeing the intelligent performance here. So we looked at only the query performance insight. So the performance overview, this is going to tell you like, okay, what is your top 5 queries by CPU consumption? And then you can see any performance recommendations that Azure is actually providing and any recommendations you decided to discard. So you may think about like, okay, I'm not going to go ahead with that recommendation, but you can also see which recommendations you avoided so that if you want to apply it at a later point, you can also do that. And this is automatic tuning. So automatic tuning is this uses the Azure SQL database built-in intelligence capability. So where you can decide on do I want to drop index or create index? So this is the one I was mentioning, where you can let Azure to do the desired state configuration automatically. So here I can say like, okay, whenever Azure finds a recommendation where an index need to be created on a table, I can turn it on and say like, okay, let Azure can create the indexes, or it can drop the indexes which is actually causing any bottleneck here with my Azure SQL database. So you can provide the capability for Azure to do automatic tuning, or you can decide like, no, I will identify what the recommendations are, but I will go ahead and apply those recommendations by myself. The other cool tip or the feature which I will be looking periodically on my Azure SQL database is this section. So it's an overview section on my Azure SQL database where I can get a view of like, okay, what are the security related things that I need to be. So if there are any notifications like you have to go and look at it, it will be alerted here. Otherwise, like I can say like has TDE is turned on, which is encryption at rest for all my databases and backups. So is I have it turned on Azure Defender for SQL. So this is doing vulnerability assessment. I can go ahead and turn it on if I need to, as well as like any auditing capability that I want or dynamic data masking if I want to configure. From a performance perspective, as I said, like automatic tuning, I haven't configured this yet. So I can go ahead and turn it on. So in a nutshell, if you want to know like has anyone, what features have been turned on your Azure SQL database or not, first thing I will check is just come and check at the overview section to get a better idea around what things have been configured, what haven't been configured from a best performance perspective, like what are the things that you have to configure here. Like for instance, I'll go ahead and configure the Azure Defender. I will check whether there is some sort of auditing that needs to be captured, then I will turn it on. And of course, automatic tuning, I'll keep an eye on that based on that. I will have a discussion with the DBAs in the organization, and based on their thinking, like I will decide on whether to turn on automatic tuning or not. But again, these are all out of the box capabilities that you get using the Azure SQL database. So moving on from that, the next thing we are going to, or a service that we are going to look at on Azure is the SQL Analytics. So this is again a good capability that you have got on Azure. So this is not available as part of your Azure SQL database provisioning. You have to provision SQL Analytics separately as a service on Azure. So what it gives you is it's a cloud monitoring solution that Microsoft have provided on Azure to monitor the performance of all your Azure SQL databases. What I showed you was just a single database. How do you go and look at the monitoring and performance activities of that database via the Azure portal? Think of a scenario where your subscription has got like a 10 or 20 Azure SQL databases provisioned for different applications. But you don't want to go into every single database to do a monitor, right? As a DBA, you want to have a single view of all your databases all in one place so that you can get all the capabilities that you saw available from one place. And also, if you think about a scenario where a lot of organizations are getting into a state where they have to take all their databases from on premises and they want to push it onto Azure. So in that scenario, like when you have on premises databases, you always had this capability like, okay, I can get a view of all my SQL servers in my organization through a single view or a single monitoring solution. So you want to have the same capability on the cloud also. So you don't want to just go and do it independently. And that's where SQL Analytics comes into play. So you can build a single view of all your databases across a single subscription or even multiple subscriptions. And what you can do is you can look at key performance metrics and all this intelligence based performance troubleshooting mechanisms, which I was showcasing for a single Azure SQL database. That's all be available for all the other databases also through your SQL Analytics. So what can go in your mind saying, because we talked about Azure SQL here, but SQL Analytics, you can use it for your managed instances. If you have multiple Elastic pools available in your Azure environment, then you can also include that into SQL Analytics. So this is, I'm talking about not only Azure SQL database, but also like managed instances and Elastic pools. Once we talk about anything on Azure, the first thing comes into mind is pricing, right? So with SQL Analytics, and it is still in preview mode, so you have the ability where you can just need to provision a log analytics. So this is for ingesting the data, because when we talk about monitoring, we have to ingest the data as well as apply data retention. So here for SQL Analytics, the pricing model is based on how much data is getting ingested. Basically, it means how many servers I'm trying to monitor, which is going to generate the volume of data that is going to be ingested on my log analytics. And then you will be paying the price based on that. So let us quickly look at how do we go about and use your SQL Analytics. So let me get back to my Azure portal here. So SQL Analytics, again, you can go to the marketplace and look for SQL Analytics. So this is actually going to bring the SQL Analytics service that is available on the marketplace. And again, it is in preview mode. So as you can see here, this is a management OMS offering, which is allowing you to monitor all your Azure resources, especially like the SQL resources. So this can be your Azure SQL database, your managed instances, and even your Elastic pools. So what I have done is, as part of provisioning this, you need to have a log analytics workspace. So you can either use an existing one, which I have already got, or you can create a new log analytics workspace. So what I have done is I have already got a log analytics workspace as well as a SQL analytics already provisioned. So this is my log analytics workspace. Cool. And what I have got is my SQL Analytics. So this is my Azure SQL Analytics. So once I provision this via the marketplace, what I can do is I can start looking at the capability of SQL Analytics to pull through all the SQL databases that are available in my subscriptions. So here, this is really good because you can hit on view summary and quickly you can get a better view of what's happening. Sorry, just let me get back here. Yeah, so what's happening in your SQL environment here? So I don't have any Elastic pools. If I have Elastic pools, it will be listed here. It has scanned through and figured out that I have got a single Azure SQL database. I don't have any managed instance databases or managed instances available here. So, but the idea behind this, if you have Elastic pools, managed instances, managed instance databases, or in number of Azure SQL databases, everything will be listed here. You click on that. There you go. And then pretty much all the databases will be listed here, and you can choose any particular database and you can start looking at getting better insights about the database. It tells you like what is a subscription, your server name, and the database name. And it is trying to get the data of what's going on in this environment. And so if there are any issues detected, it will be showing me the diagnostic logs. And you can see here straight away all the information about that particular database. Here I have just got one database, right? If I have listed all the other databases, I'll have a better insight of all my databases using this one interface. So this is how easy it is because I don't need to worry about jumping onto the different resource groups and clicking on every single Azure SQL database or my managed instance to figure out what's happening on my databases. So this is providing my view of what is the DTU utilization, CPU utilization, data IO and log IO. So all these metrics is already available on Azure, right? What they have done is with the SQL Analytics, they pulled through all the metrics related to the databases in a single view here. So any timeouts that are being detected and any blockings that are being detected, it's all will be available here. So in order to get this working, the only thing you have to do is on your Azure SQL database. So this is my Azure SQL database. You need to go under diagnostic settings and feed the data. So here what I have made sure is I created my diagnostic setting and I have turned on all the logging. So, okay, log about everything. So any deadlocks that are happening on my Azure SQL database, blockings, timeouts, errors, my wait statistics, and all the metrics that I really require. And then I have chosen here, send all the output of my diagnostic outputs into my log analytics workspace. And this is what the only thing I configured before I got seeing that statistics on my SQL Analytics. So this is something you have to configure for your databases. Once you have done that, then you can go back to your Azure SQL Analytics, which is going to pull through all the diagnostic details that you configured for your Azure SQL databases in this single interface. So now you understood the linkages, right? So your databases are going to push all the diagnostic logs to your log analytics workspace. Because that log analytics workspace is already linked with Azure SQL Analytics solution here, you get a single view of all your metrics information in one place for all your SQL servers. So something to keep in mind, if you provisioned Azure SQL Analytics and you can't see any of your databases listed here, that is because like you wouldn't have turned on the diagnostic settings on your Azure SQL databases. Make sure you turn it on so you have a better view of these things. Cool. So what I will also quickly show you is what is actually generating some metrics. So this is a simple function app that I have deployed and which has got a timer based function. So what I have done is this Azure function is going to execute every minute. And what it is trying to do is to go and run some 5 queries, which I'm going to issue against to my Azure SQL database. So every minute it is running 5 sets of select statements to pull data from that. So this is just to generate some sort of activity happening in my Azure SQL so that when I turn on monitoring and things, I know what is like I will get some metrics that I can showcase. So if you are learning about monitoring, that's a good way how you can generate some sample activity in your Azure SQL database. Just put some Azure functions or something which periodically goes and hits your database to create some activity. And then when you start looking at your performance overview or your metrics and things, you can start looking at the graph showing some sort of activity happening here. So this is a cool way if you are in the early stages of learning about Azure SQL and monitoring in Azure SQL. That's how you can go ahead and practice it with some samples that you can generate by yourself. Cool. Let me get back to my slides. So in a nutshell, what we have been looking at the different ways that out of the box, how you can use the tools that are available on the Azure portal in order to monitor your Azure SQL databases. We looked at the Azure Monitor, which is pretty much turning on the metrics. So which I'll show you quickly here. My Azure SQL database. So always look at under your database, and this is where the settings you need to look under. Under monitoring, you can see your metrics. So this is the way you can turn on the metric and immediately you can see what's happening on your Azure SQL database. If you are using Azure SQL Analytics, make sure that you turn on your diagnostic settings here. And the other thing is if you want to monitor like your DTU usage or something, and if it reaches more than 85% and you want to get an alert, then you can set up your alerts through here. So you can go ahead and create your new alert rule and you can say like, okay, I want to add a condition. And what I'm going to look at as a signal type is my CPU or a DTU activity. If it is more than 85% or something, immediately you can just configure the key people who needs to receive an email or a text message. Cool. So here, DTU percentage. The key reason I'm just highlighting the DTU percentage is because I know like if it goes more than 85% or something, I need to go to the next level of DTUs, which means there is a cost associated, right? So which means I have to proactively monitor this so I can get back to my management and say like, okay, our consumption is increasing here. And I have validated it's nothing to do with the performance of our queries. It's more because of the increase in data that is hitting our Azure SQL. So you can present your case and you can proactively monitor it and cater for your DTU percentage increase. So you can go here and say if it is more than 85%, you can create an action group saying who are the people who needs to be notified. So you can either use an existing one or you can create a new action group. So here you can specify who needs to be notified, what mechanism that you want to notify with. So is it an email, SMS, or voice push notifications? You can configure this and you can set up the alerts. So that's another way how you can do alerts in here. So post to that, we also looked at query performance insight. So if you want to identify any queries that are creating bottlenecks, you can look at which query that is causing the bottleneck, and also you can figure out what is the query text that gets executed, which is really handy because if there are some store procedures or things running, you have a better view of which query is actually getting executed that is causing a bottleneck for your CPU or your IO. And of course, you can turn on automatic tuning. And if you really need to, otherwise, you can just look at the performance recommendations that are provided by Microsoft or Azure. And then what you can do is you can decide on whether you want to apply it or not. And finally, we also talked about DMVs, right? So you can use DMVs by connecting your Azure SQL, either using Azure Data Studio or SQL Server Management Studio, and you can run those DMVs straight on your Azure SQL database. So that's another way of looking at how can you just look at or get in-depth analysis of what's going on with your Azure SQL database. And of course, the important thing which I highlighted was always if you are looking at the Azure SQL database or any Azure databases for the first time, always look at the overview tab just to get a quick understanding of what are the things that has been configured from a best practice perspective, what hasn't been configured, find out the rationale why it hasn't been configured, and then go ahead and configure it if it is really required. So that is another way how I'll be looking at. So I'm looking at this from the aspect of the key things that we need to look at from a monitoring perspective. Of course, we can go in depth here from a security perspective or different aspect like encryption, or how do we make sure encryption at rest is carried over. How do we make sure only the required connections are made only from the correct relevant applications, like you're configuring your VNet and so on. So that is taking a different aspect, looking at security. But from a monitoring and performance perspective, even if you start some of the basics which I have highlighted here, looking at your resource consumption, your query optimizations, and also the basic level of configurations that have been done on your Azure SQL database, that itself is a good start. And make sure you start with this, and further along this, then you can start evaluating what things that you still additionally need to monitor, and whether they are available right out of the box. If not, then you can start looking at your third party monitoring tools. So the point I'm highlighting here is, just because you don't have or your organization haven't purchased a third party monitoring tool, it doesn't mean you can't monitor your Azure SQL databases. There are built-in monitoring capability that are available on Azure. Try and utilize that. And if you need any additional extra capabilities that are not available, then you can start evaluating your third-party monitoring tools to get a better overview. So these are some of the URLs that you can go ahead and get better knowledge or better insights about some of these concepts that I explained in today's session. And of course, if you have any questions, this is an opportunity for you to just fire me with any of the questions that you have got around some of the monitoring capabilities that I walked you through on Azure.
Well, thank you, Anu. As Anu mentioned, if you do have any questions, you can either put them in the chat window for us to ask Anu, or you can take yourself off of mute and ask Anu the questions yourself. We do have a couple of minutes left in this session, so while you are thinking about that, and okay, so we do have Anu, are logs downloadable?
So is the logs available on the log analytics? Yes, you can view them. But in terms of downloadable, I don't think you will be getting those logs downloadable. But using DMVs, you will be able to execute and get the information that you need.
Is that what you were looking for, Ashok?
No, actually, what happens, most of the logs, whatever is generated within Azure, and as well as in the Office 365 portal or Power Apps or Power BI, they are all the activities are downloadable. So I was very specific in terms of, because you said if the logs are more than 90 days, then that get truncated. Otherwise, you have got to pay. If the logs are downloadable, then I can collect it outside. Then I use it in my Power BI portal or wherever to use it for any analytics for the history reasons.
Yes, I think that if you are asking in that context, yes, you can use your own built-in log aggregator tools that you have got. But if you think about it, log analytics itself is a log aggregator tool on Azure portal, right? So there is, what I said was, you have this out of the box, okay, app insights or something that provides you the 90 days of holding your logs. But you can always pay additional if you want to hold 2 years or 3 years worth of log data, or you can export it into a blob storage. So one of the capability, let me quickly show you. on the Azure portal, when I turned on the diagnostic logs here, I showed only I turned it on only to log analytics. The reason for that is that I needed that to showcase the SQL Analytics capability. But I can always log this information into a storage account or even stream it into an event hub if I need to. So in this way, you can just store your logs. It doesn't need to be on log analytics, but it can be on a cheap storage account that you can use for, as you said, if you want to pull it into your Power BI reports or something, you can do that.
Okay, that's good. Thank you.
But if you want to use the out-of-the-box capabilities like the charts and things that are available on Azure, then that's when you have to think about, am I going to extend the amount of logs that needs to be stored via the log analytics?
Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Ashok.
Excuse me, does anybody else have any other questions for Anu? Comment from Carlos. Very, very interesting information. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Carlos. I think some of these things, it's really discoverable, because even when I started working on Azure SQL, and especially for clients who didn't have any monitoring tools, and it was really wealth of information that is already available to showcase to them how their databases were performing.
Ashok, where you're asking about resources, are you meaning the links from the slide deck, etc.?
Correct. Yep. Those links, etc. She referred in the slides, especially those DMVs, etc. Wherever they are available, those and hex.
Yeah. So we'll make available with the recording from today's session. Will be available on the YouTube channel, as well as with that we will have some links to the slide decks that you're able to gain access to.
Okay, that's good. Thank you.
No problems.
Yeah, so what I can also do is, Warwick, I can provide that sample Azure function code. So if you just want to practice some of these things, what you can do is you can just provision the Azure SQL database, as I showed, turn on the sample database as option, and then you can deploy the Azure function code, which I'm giving onto your Azure portal, which is going to be run every minute, and it will generate some activity on your database, which means you will be able to start looking at some of these insights. Any other question or?
Just another comment. So I know always your sessions are very useful and informed. Thank you.
Thanks for that.
Well, if nobody else has any other questions, I'd like to thank Anu for giving up her time and presenting today on the tips on how to monitor your Azure SQL database. I'd like to thank everybody for coming along and being part of this session today. And as mentioned, the session has been recorded and will be uploaded to the YouTube channel. So if you are wanting to come back and view this, sign up and register with the YouTube channel, promote the YouTube channel, and as a community, we will grow. Continue your learning, and we have for next week's session, our third session for the month, we have Vitor Fava talking to us about creating a data analysis using Azure Automated Machine Learning. So I look forward to seeing everybody again in a week's time. Stay safe. Enjoy your learning. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Warwick, for the opportunity.
You're welcome, Anu.